I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, what are we looking at today?
Before we get into what we're looking at today, I want to clarify something because we got an email from someone expressing surprise at this fact, but Lee and I are not related in any way.
I mean,
we have the same last name, and that's it.
But we are both Southerners.
Kind of.
I mean, I guess...
My family's from Texas,
which Texans,
and people from Texas would insist to the bone they're not Southerners.
Despite the fact Texas is the South, just with slightly better barbecue and slightly worse manners.
We just lost all of our listeners from the state of Texas. There may not even be any, I don't know, but if there were, they're not there. The one listener, right. So what are we looking at today?
Is it? No, it can't be. I thought we've done this before.
We have. We've done it twice, exactly. Right.
So this is our third time doing Lucian's Diary of a Madman?
This is it. We have done this same text 2 other times.
So I was thinking about this earlier, and it feels kind of appropriate when we're doing this. Our recording is on All Saints' Day, All Spirits' Day, or something. You know, it's November 1st, and it feels a little bit like Ghost of Podcast Past.
It does. They just come back. You know, it's really funny. This was an early podcast we did, and we lost the file. Then we recorded it much later and lost that file. So we're doing it yet again. Lee mentioned All Saints' Day. It is appropriate as well that we're doing this day after Halloween because the story itself has been characterized by at least one of our colleagues as a sort of a proto-zombie story. It is, and which is not exactly true in that it literally involves zombies, but it's very peculiar.
No, it kind of...
Depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to frame this so we can dive in.
Please.
But by now, if you're not already somewhat familiar with Lucian, the main fact you need to know is that he's likely the most well-known Chinese writer of the 20th century within China. He's one of the people who helmed the May 4th movement in 1919 and later.
He definitely defines Chinese literature in the terms of the PRC, right?
Right, or in terms of social concern, because he wrote well before the PRC. But
that's correct, yeah. He died well before.
This is often categorized, probably unfairly, but I know what people are getting at, as the first real modern vernacular Chinese short story.
So we've done earlier podcasts on Huaben, and those are vernacular. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, in the kind of category that the May 4th, or the way May 4th thought about literature, Huaben does not count as literature. They just kind of ignored all of that stuff. There's tons of other earlier vernacular fiction, but this is the first thing to conscientiously say, we are going to not be classical. We're not going to be Wen Yan Wen. We are vernacular straight up.
Right.
Whereas the Huaben were not as ideological about it.
And it's not just ideological. This is also an attempt. To what extent he succeeded is debatable, but an attempt to go back to the idea that literature should express orality, so that what you're reading on the page is supposed to be the way people talk. Mm-hmm. Huaben arguably started that way. One of the studies on the sort of the roots of this genre start off with it's just standard sitting around a fire telling stories, but at some point it stops being that and becomes much more self-consciously literary in scare quotes. And what Lucian and others at the beginning of this movement are trying to do is basically swing it right back to everyday people just talking on the page literature. Now, what we're reading is reported to be a journal by a man in a village who is convinced that everyone in his village is a cannibal and is going to try to eat him. That is the story.
And it's just a kind of description of what he thinks he sees.
His descent into madness, essentially.
But what's interesting is so that's all written in vernacular Chinese, and it's fairly easy for someone like the person on the streets of Beijing,
right,
to just pick that part up and read it, even if they're fairly uneducated.
Right.
But it's prefaced, and this is important. It has a preface to it, and that's written in classical Chinese.
Right.
And the classical Chinese portion essentially says, this is about a guy who got sick, and he didn't know what he was talking about. He's all better now. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about him. That's essentially the point of the preface. And what's maddening about this whole story, and I think this is something we've discussed in previous recensions of this podcast is that one of the questions that lingers over the story is, who do you trust? And
right.
for the reader at the time this is written in 1917, they're going to say, well, you ought to trust, instinctively they're going to suggest that you should trust the classical Chinese, because anything written in classical Chinese, it's authoritative. It's authoritative, right? And so there are all these kind of weird linguistic questions. Why do we actually believe that this is a madman?
Right.
Well, how do we know that what he's seeing isn't true?
Right.
And
no, go ahead.
One of the points that the madman in his madness makes is that Chinese tradition, that is Confucianism, is several thousand years of parents eating children. He's arguing that, at least in a literal sense, that Chinese culture is a kind of cannibalism. It's eating future generations alive. And the argument is that you have to break with the tradition. That's implied, at least in the text.
Here's the question, though. And this is something that I find sticky when we get to Lu Xun, is that Lu Xun, the person, is so outspoken about his distaste for classical learning that we tend to read what he wrote, especially the stories, entirely through that lens. And yet most of them, this one included, are a lot more complicated than that.
It's incredibly complicated.
So this one, for example, if we're the standard reading of it is what you just said, that classical culture in China cannibalizes people. And Lu Xun, in the preface to his collection called Arms, has his own sort of account about this, that he compares classical culture to an iron house that keeps people asleep and locked up forever. So it seems reasonable, and it is reasonable, to read Diary of a Madman in that sense. But here's the trick. Like you say, first, the preface in classical, right? If you were dead set against classical, why write a preface in the first place? And second, what leads this madman specifically to assume, based on sort of his readings of classical whatever, that cannibals are everywhere, is not actually something on the page that says people are cannibals. It is him obsessing about margin notes until he basically just loses his mind and begins sort of in Jack Nicholson in The Shining style.
Here's Lu Xun.
Just writing the same thing over and over again, right?
He is basing it off of classical, canonical Chinese.
But the question is this: is he reading them well, or is he taking a few margin notes and a few things that he's just reading into like in isolation and deriving his entire belief from that? Because what we assume, based on Lu Xun's preface to all this stuff, is that he's reading a lot of classics, and the number of classics he's reading are kind of driving him crazy. But is it that, or is he just not reading them well?
I think that that question lingers over the entire story.
I would agree.
I don't think it provides a clear answer, and that's one of the things that makes Lu Xun such a great writer. And I, said nasty things about Lu Xun.
And the entire movement as well.
But I think that I have to deal with him seriously, because he is just an incredible writer.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of how he doesn't allow any stability in the narrative.
Right.
You constantly, every time you think you've got something and you can hold on to a point, you can say, this is what Lu Xun thinks. Actually, no, there's something else. There's something else there that can kind of countermand.
Right, and so this is one of the things that makes Lu Xun's legacy so tricky in China, is he's very clearly outspoken against the tradition, and yet he's using it to criticize it, and the characters he sets forth are not clear-cut enough to use as a hard and fast attack on the classical tradition. This guy, for example, is going insane if we read the journal as an actual journal, right? But it's incredibly unclear if he was already basically unbalanced when he started reading the classics, or if he doesn't know how to read the classics and that made him unbalanced, or something else.
And let's be clear, Lu Xun knew his classics like the back of his hand. He was an incredible classics
scholar.
He wrote pieces in classical Chinese that are quite difficult for us to read today, but he was writing in classical Chinese, so he knows his classical.
Mm-hmm.
So it is sort of about his tortured relationship with this linguistic tradition that he, on some level, I think, has to respect.
Right. And so it's crucially important, though, to remember this story in its, not just historical context, but its legacy, because Lu Xun is, so far as I'm aware, really, the only writer who survives unscathed through the entire 20th century to the present. He is still included on propaganda posters, just Cultural Revolution.
Just to be clear, he died in the
1930s. Yes, thank you, yes. But his legacy, not him personally. He is on propaganda posters in the Cultural Revolution, where the government says promote Lu Xun's revolutionary spirit, etc.
Yeah, he's big in the Cultural Revolution.
He's huge, and still is huge.
He's still very much taught in Chinese schools.
Yes.
This is the thing that people talk about. When I was in class a couple of months ago, we had a Chinese student. He said, he wanted to grapple with Lu Xun in our class. We were reading some Lu Xun, and he thought it was incredibly difficult, incredibly hard to understand the right answer to Lu Xun, the right way to interpret Lu Xun. And this is one of the things, it's not so much Lu Xun that I have a problem with. Sometimes it's the tradition that's developed around him in the PRC, which I think is over.
It's kind of worshipful in a way.
It's worshipful, but also it expects a right answer. And I don't think. And with Lu Xun, one of the things that's most interesting about him is that he doesn't provide any right answers.
No, and I want to bring in an interesting analog because this takes us to another anniversary, which is the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's posting of the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg Church door. Now, first, there's not a lot of hard and fast evidence he ever actually posted them in the first place. But the reason I bring him up is because people have a certain assumption for how Martin Luther wrote, what he believed, how he believed it. If you ever actually read Martin Luther, it's far more difficult and complicated than the legend suggests. Like I recently reread, or read for the first time, I guess, all 95 Theses. It is not what you're expecting, right? In the same way, China has this canonical literary figure. Lu Xun is canonical.
And he has been mythologized.
And he's absolutely been mythologized. So it's interesting, and we get into weird discussions if you go to China as a scholar from the US or Europe, and you make commentaries about, or you write commentaries about Lu Xun, or conduct a seminar or something. Because frequently you're faced with this, yes, but that's not what Lu Xun meant. That's not how you read Lu Xun. And I'm not saying there's a criticism to the people saying it, but it can be very difficult to know how to communicate about this. Because we read Lu Xun as works of literature, which we can and should break down, look at the language, recontextualize. But for a figure who's this canonical, doing that is problematic.
Let me be clear. I'm okay with criticizing.
I am totally okay with that.
Who do that.
I see what you're saying. No, I'm not cool with that.
So I'm okay with criticizing people who say this is the only way to read Lu Xun.
Yeah. Not a huge fan of it either. But I get where they're coming from, I guess is what I'm saying.
I mean, the word you use, canonical, I think, brings us to the point that you made earlier about hero worship. I mean, he is most definitely worshipped as a hero, but I think that obscures more than it elucidates.
And it's fascinating because Diary of a Madman, which is, I believe, serialized the first time in 1918, really becomes a big thing, quote-unquote, in 1919. But Lu Xun had been doing literary work for nearly 2 decades before that.
He'd done translations.
Lots of translations, mostly translations.
Yeah. He'd done some scholarly work.
A lot of scholarly. He wrote a lot of scientific articles, for example, medical and scientific articles. So there's this another sort of aspect of the canonicity that has him just sort of appearing fully fledged with Diary of a Madman, which is totally not true. He went through a lot of literary selves before then. He was translating Jules Verne from Japanese to Chinese because he was really looking to have like a popular impact, And it isn't until this that he's actually self-consciously writing literature with a capital L.
Can I ask you to go back, to bring it back more to the story?
Yeah.
who do you trust in this story? If you have to come down on one side, do you trust that he is mad, or do you actually think that the madman, quote-unquote madman, is seeing something that's very real, and it's the rest of society that is mad? That the rest of society is saying, hey, it's okay to eat people. It's fine. It's totally acceptable.
I think I read him as mad, partially because the people he's quoting in the story, his brother, for example, when he quotes them, the quotations are so realistic and so ordinary that it's hard to see them as nefarious at all.
Good. I'm glad you did that, because I actually don't think he's mad.
Good.
I totally disagree.
And this is important. When Lee's wrong and I'm right, we get a lot more done this way.
I think that he hits on something that is really wrong with Chinese society at that time, and he's seeing through the kind of mist that this discourse, this long discourse, has created.
So you're saying he's literally surrounded by cannibals.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're literally going to eat his flesh, cannibals. Not metaphorically, but they're trying to eat him.
Well, I mean,
and how can that possibly exist? Or be
the story in and of itself is metaphorical, so I don't know the distinction between literal or metaphors.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, if you say he's seeing something, what is he seeing? Is he making a commentary, and we're not catching it, or is it because he's convinced he's seeing, in the words of the Sixth Sense, dead people? He's seeing cannibals, and they are literally trying to eat him.
Yeah.
So he's in a village of people trying to eat him.
Yeah.
Lee is choosing to read fantasy and allegory as literal. Well, think about this the next time you criticize someone for reading the first 2 chapters of Genesis as allegorical, literal. I also think one of the reasons, though, I would have to disagree is because Lu Xun is consciously basing this on a Russian short story by Nikolai Gogol, exactly the same title, Diary of a Madman. And that
which is much
clearly
less interesting.
Yes. Well, I think it's funnier, actually.
Yeah.
But the big difference here, and the reason that arguments even exist about this kind of stuff, is that the Nikolai Gogol short story has no preface. It just dives right in the diary, right? They just, quote-unquote, find this diary in an insane asylum or something. Whereas what we have here is a reputedly sane person writing in classical Chinese, like any sane person would, about this person, and we found his diary, but he's okay now.
But I just think, to get back to the insane thing, I really do think that Lu Xun tends to be so much more critical of the classical tradition, even though he's writing in it, even though he is brought up in the classical tradition. I think, and the fact that it's the classical tradition which says, this guy was just mad, now he's better, he feels better now. I don't understand how we can take that so seriously, and that's, I mean, I'm being a bit flip when I say yes. He's actually, I'm doing that partially to be provocative, but
he never does that. I'm surprised.
First time in my life, I swear. The listener can't hear me crossing my fingers
or see you. They couldn't hear you even if they were in the same room. But
yeah, they can you not hear the noise?
No, I can't be.
What is the sound of 2 fingers?
2 fingers crossing. Silence.
I'm being a bit flip on this, and I want to make that clear. I am trying to be provocative, but I think there is something very. It's very difficult to take the classical preface seriously. I think neither of us are taking it 100% seriously. But I would come down on the side of Lu Xun is arguing that something is very wrong in Chinese society, and he is trying to diagnose the problem. And I use the word diagnose very specifically because Lu Xun was trained in medicine.
Yeah.
And what he's doing, and this is the classical, I don't know why I'm the one giving the classical kami reading, but I am. But this is the classical kami reading in that you have, it's all just a critique of old, quote-unquote, old China. They're the scare quotes again. Mm-hmm. I think that at least within the sphere of thinking about Lu Xun, there is a lot of validity.
What I am saying is the way he's saying it makes it a lot trickier to know what exactly he's critiquing or seeing. Because if this to some extent expresses Lucian's distaste for or disapproval of the classical culture, what exactly is he disapproving of? It's not, in total, all classical culture up to the present, because he writes his own diary in classical Chinese, Lucian does. So it can't be that. What is it? The specific stuff that the Madman story is obsessing about is not the content of the text. It's isolated phrases that he's insisting on repeating or seeing over and over again.
Maybe, but we also have to think about how prefaces functioned in classical Chinese literature. Prefaces were not only to indicate this kind of guiding authorial voice, they also suggested that there is some sort of narrative change going on, that there is someone who is editing this. Mm-hmm. So we also have to think of the preface writer as a kind of editor. So what is this guy, and it's necessarily a man, what is this guy taking out, and why is he only leaving in certain things? What is his agenda? Again, this is the great thing about this story, and almost all of Lucian is we don't have any, like as soon as you feel like you've grasped it, it totally slips out of your
You say something like, well, he's clearly saying this, and you go, okay, what about this passage?
Well,
and you're like, that passage. Yeah. And so it's interesting because, and this is going to be my parting thought on the text, is the reason that I so enjoy Lucian is because contrary to his legend, I suppose, he's an immensely complex figure, not just a writer, but figure. He's someone who joins one movement, drops out, writes one thing, stops writing it, writes another thing, stops writing that. He can never settle on any one thing. I think this story is indicative of exactly why that is. He knows that there's a ton of stuff wrong, but he has no idea exactly to the letter what that is or what to do about it. You can't just blame all things pre-1919. So what do you blame? What do you pull out of it?
And I think that's one of the things that I both love and hate about Lucian. He points out the problem, but he doesn't really show a solution. And I think it's incredibly interesting the way he points out that problem, or all of these problems, because there are so many problems we're not even tackling today in this one single story.
Right.
And he points them out in a manner that's incredibly interesting, if not the best written.
Well, and I would argue that Lucian understands what the problems were a lot better than his contemporaries, and the proof of that is because he can't nail them down. Right? Anyone who says, "Oh, it's just this one thing," you don't understand what you're talking about. It's always more complex than that.
But my problem with Lucian is that it's not Lucian's fault, but the way he gets used in contemporary PRC culture is he's presented as a guy who sees the problem and knows the solution.
And nailed it, yeah. That I would agree with.
And that's, I think, less than satisfying. So that's less Lucian's fault and more of just kind of
the legacy.
The legacy. I also, and I've argued this before, I don't think he's nearly as good of a writer as others in the Chinese tradition, particularly Jia Ling. But I know that's a debate that we will continue to have.
We will definitely continue to have it, because I will always disagree.
And you will always be wrong.
Well, I'm fine with that, as long as you understand that I'm right sometimes.
And I think that's a great place to call it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.